Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Simmons, and I am so excited to be able to record another lecture or presentation, what have you, for you all for our class. If you haven't already noticed, these recordings on Fridays will have a focus on justice and social change. Rather than waiting until the end of the semester to talk about justice and social change, I will try to make sure that integrated throughout the semester, and especially on Fridays on these live recordings, or sorry, not live, on these recordings, that the emphasis on social change will not be lost, especially as we start talking about some really depressing topics for some about inequality. Now, I should say that I say it's depressing for some because as a sociologist, at times I do find studying racism and inequality and injustice and capitalism and gender, I do find that to be depressing at times, but I also find it to be liberating. I find it to be liberating because there is a principle in sociology. It was on the webpage and in the mission of the sociology program when I was a student in undergrad at Ithaca College. It's a perspective on sociology that I still hold dear to my heart. And that belief and that principle is that if the world around us is constructed by society, meaning us, people, and if there are some things that are wrong, that are causing suffering in that society, we should have hope because we have the power to recreate and reconstruct society. Granted, with constraints, so we don't have the agency to change the world, change the systems by ourselves, but we do have the power and the agency to reconstruct society in the spaces that are in our realm of control and influence. I don't have the power or the authority or the influence to change the world, change whole systems. But I do have some influence as an educator to construct a classroom. That's why I love being a teacher again. I absolutely love it. I have the autonomy to create a culture amongst our young adults, you, our learners. And so let me say this. We, in this society that we're in right now, we have just had a horrible, horrible course of events that just took place. And that was the murder of influencer and political commentator, political activist Charlie Kirk. For those of you who know me in this class, who, and from what I have tried to teach so far, you will know that I am passionately anti-racist. I am passionately pro-civil rights. And I lead with my faith to try to be a good servant leader. And a servant leader means using our resources and influence and abilities, to try to help other people reach their goals and to help improve their well-being. That is a tradition of my faith that the civil rights movement promoted, that the abolitionist movement promoted, that so many other, like the Jesuit communities and the Catholic Church, even though I'm not Catholic, promoted. I believe in that servant leadership tradition across spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, and political beliefs. So obviously, a lot of my beliefs probably conflicted with those of Mr. Charlie Kirk. And yet, despite those disagreements in core values, I, in front of you all, need to say unequivocally that the murder of Charlie Kirk or any other person is wrong. It is absolutely wrong and it should be condemned. Violence is wrong. And I would not be doing my job as an educator if I didn't say to you all that in my classroom and the space that I try to create for you all, I will not tolerate any celebration or any glee or anything like that about the murder of another human being. I will not. I will not. And I'm not saying that because I think that any of you will do that in my class, but I'm saying that because as the person who is trying to help construct a social space in this classroom through digital forms and through in-person interactions, you all need to know who your instructor is. And as an instructor, I take it as my duty and my responsibility to be real with you all and to help set expectations. And so that's what I'm doing. Trying to be real, and I'm trying to set expectations. There's no teleprompter, there's no script. I have notes, but this is me speaking, and I want you all to see that I'm speaking this from the heart, because right now this is a difficult time. There was a moment with Dr. King, and let me stop and say, I'm not talking about the Dr. King that has been stripped of any real politics or anything like that. I'm talking about Dr. King, the organizer, the civil rights activist, and the passionate servant leader whose faith also drove him as a Christian who believed in the social gospel. After his house was bombed, and luckily his child at the time and his wife were safe, but after his house was bombed, he had some folks outside of his house, folks who were a part of the movement that he was helping to build as a spokesperson, and they were outside his house and listening and looking for direction. And here's what he said. And this is an excerpt from the book, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Love, on page 22. And I just noticed, funny enough, this speech called The Sermon on the Porch was delivered on January 30th, 1956. And my birthday is January 30th. But I wasn't born in 1956, although I may look like it sometimes. So here's what he said. He said, "We believe in law and order. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky at all. Do not get your weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, that is what God said. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them. Love them. And let them know you love them. I did not start this boycott." Talking about the Montgomery bus boycott. "I was asked by you to serve as your spokesman. I want it known, the length and breadth of this land, that if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. If I am stopped, our work will not stop. For what we are doing is right. What we are doing is just. And God is with us." Even if you do not believe in God, and I'm not trying to promote Christian beliefs, but going back to the sociological imagination, his background, his cultural background, his religious background, and the environment that he was in obviously was shaping how he moved and how he acted. And I want you all to know that part of what shapes how I act and how I think and how I behave as a professor, just like so many other professors, is also my religious background or spiritual beliefs, along with my duty to try to help you all to be critical thinkers and to help you all see how the sociological tools and a sociological perspective could be helpful for you to reach your goals. So that is the main purpose and the main intent that I have in mind. And I believe, just like Dr. King, that if we want to see a better society, violent methods are not the answer. Violent methods are not safe. Violent methods do not seem to work. And when I think about my children and grandchildren in the future one day, hopefully, or my cousins and nephews and nieces and what have you, I want them to be able to look at me, just like I want them to be to look at you in the future and be able to say that they tried their best to do right and they tried their best to serve humanity. Not even because we think everybody deserves it or because we're trying to be perfect, but simply because it's the right thing to do. I look forward to continuing this conversation in person on next week on Monday, but I did not want to move on and not acknowledge this tragic situation that we're in. But I will also create a space for us to talk about this further. So, given that that is the terrain that we're navigating, I believe it is the best use of our time for this presentation, for this asynchronous meeting and conversation, is to talk about what are the sociological tools that can help us be able to be advocates for justice and however we define that, and be advocates for change, but do so in a way that aligns with our commitment, if you have that. And I think as sociologists, I think a lot of us do, our commitment to peace and nonviolence. What does peaceful advocacy look like? And in the title, I'm going to put in the social media era, because I'm noticing a pattern, and I suspect that you have noticed this pattern too, that at least when I go into social media, whether it's the comment section on TikTok or if it's on Facebook, and especially in my experience on Twitter or now X, it is not cool. It is not constantly rewarded. You're not getting a ton of clicks or anything like that for saying and doing positive things in reaction to other people. Instead, the era that we're in, where social media dominates how so many of us, especially our younger folks, get their news. So when I talk to a lot of folks in your generation, a lot of you get your news from social media. YouTube is social media. TikTok is social media. Facebook, X, what have you. You get a lot of your notions of how the world works, about how culture works, how politics works. You get a lot of that from social media. And unfortunately, so much of what catches on social media and what's promoted and reinforced is a combination of a focus on the self and what I need, and that's pretty much it, and what looks good to get engagement, and an insult culture, a culture where insults, roasting, what have you, it's not just that it happens. I am not above roast sessions. I'm not above comedy. I'm not above even dark humor sometimes, or what some people call gallows humor. I think sometimes a lot of us use humor to cope. But if we're constantly fed the message that the way to operate, the way to react, the way to respond is to try to take that person down, to make fun of other people in ways that can cross a line, especially in ways that we would never do in person. It's hard not to think how that can negatively impact the ways that we even try to advocate for change. If takedowns and insults and blankety blank destroys blankety blank, if that is what so much of our culture promotes, then I think it's fair to say that we have to at least use our sociological imagination to think, how does that impact the ways that we try to approach justice or try to approach social change? And then to think, what are some ways that we can intervene if we believe that that's not beneficial or good, or if we believe it's just something that's an obstacle to the ideal worlds that we believe in? Then what does an alternative approach look like that is in line with our values like peace and nonviolence? That's the terrain that we're in. That's the water that we're swimming in. And just like a fish in the water, it just takes on the appearance of this is just how things are. A fish never stops to reflect on what is water. And it's hard for us to stop and reflect on what is it about the water that we're swimming in? How is that shaping and potentially negatively impacting the ways that we move? And so, one of the sociological tools that is very helpful for doing that is, besides mindfulness, which is taking a moment to observe without judgment, how our brain reacts and how we move and all those different things. But another sociological tool that is, I found to be very, very helpful is something that I actually created. And it's called the culture responsive organizing um, spectrum. The culture responsive organizing spectrum. Here's what that looks like. What it looks like in practice is to first, let's say I have noticed a pattern where there are a bunch of teachers and students at Nazareth College, just to use, or Nazareth University as an example. I'm not saying this is what's happening, but let's not even say Nazareth. Let's say there's a bunch of students and teachers and administrators at some random college that we have a very clear disagreement. Let's say that they believe that sociology classes should not exist, and I believe that sociology classes should exist. One approach to that dilemma, to that issue, is to go let them have it, as some of us would say, is to go and preach to them about why their beliefs are wrong and to let them know that they are wrong for having those beliefs. And maybe even throw in some funny insults or some funny comments or what have you, especially if we know that it's recorded so it can get boosted on social media. That is one approach. And I would be lying if I didn't say to you that that was an approach that for a while that I helped fuel when I was a lot younger, in part because it made me feel better. Sometimes it feels good to be able to say or do something that gets a lot of likes or a lot of clicks, or a lot of retweets or what have you. And if it's funny, and not think a little bit about what type of approach to change am I modeling and what is that doing to me as a person as well? How is that impacting how my brain operates? And what am I modeling at the same time? An alternative approach, one that's a little bit more sociological and one that I found very effective and helpful, and that the teachers who I've talked to have also found to be helpful, is to approach it with a culture responsive organizing perspective. So, culture responsive organizing. Let's dig into that. Culture, broadly speaking, refers to the toolkit, the tools that are available to people on how to solve problems. The best way I can say it too is that I know I can tell a lot about a culture in a school by looking at the pattern and how people in that school describe, analyze, and work to solve problems that they have in their interactions and within that social terrain. So, for example, one social issue that a lot of us deal with all the time is um, how to dress in a way that expresses what I care about and who I am, and doesn't promote a negative association with me. Knowing what to dress and how to appear on the stage that we call society is a problem or an issue that many of us at least spend some time thinking about on a routine basis. I can tell a lot about a culture by looking at the patterns and how people use clothing to communicate something about who they are and what they care about. I thought of that example just now because if you look at my shirt, I'm a Bills fan. Go Bills all day, every day. My fantasy team has James Cook, and I'm so happy. Somebody took Josh Allen, but I love watching the Bills. I'm proud to be a Bills fan, and many of people in my family are Bills fans. And so when I started working at a nearby public school district, as I've shared with you all, one thing I noticed is that right before the game and right after the game, a lot of people wear their Bills attire because they want to not only communicate something about themselves, but they also want to communicate that they're a part of this broader network or broader team of Bills fans. And I wanted to communicate that I'm also a part of that group. And so I bought a lot more Bills gear. I even had my wife use her Cricut to create some Bills gear for me. And that helped me to show to other people that we have some similarities. And that is so important, finding some similarities and common ground, because our brains are hardwired to push us in the direction to be a part of the community, to be a part of a collective. And people are more likely to trust you and care about you if they find some similarities, even something that might seem as simple as being a Bills fan. That's an example of being able to analyze, like a sociologist, something like culture. Cultural responsiveness refers to this broader tradition in amongst teachers in education of teaching learners, teaching students new ideas or new concepts by showing the connections to and building on a foundation of their pre-existing knowledge and culture. For example, if I want to teach, let's say somebody who is, let's say somebody who is 90 years old about YouTube, and they've never interacted with YouTube and they're not unfamiliar with what that looks like, I'm not going to make a reference to something on YouTube or on some other social media platform if they don't really use social media to help that 90-year-old to understand what YouTube is, because it's not building on a foundation of their pre-existing knowledge. And they probably do not operate in a cultural background or cultural space where social media and YouTube is dominant. So if I want them to learn what YouTube is, I need to build on something related to their pre-existing knowledge and related to their culture, not just mine, but theirs, to build the bridge and close the gap between what they know before and them knowing what YouTube is. That is what culturally responsive teaching, just in a very brief description, that's kind of what it looks like. And along with building those bridges to pre-existing knowledge, it's being able to use also our understanding of how to build relationships with people across cultural orientations to create a safe space so that they are relaxed and able to hear what I'm saying as a teacher. So, for example, if I'm teaching that person, that 90-year-old about YouTube, and I respond with disgust and dismay, that how do they obviously not know what YouTube is? Where have they been? Have they been living under a rock? What is wrong with them? If I even give them that impression that I'm judging them for making mistakes, judging them as a person for making mistakes, and especially if we don't have a strong relationship where they view that as lighthearted humor, as opposed to if I say and do some things that feels like a genuine slight against them and they don't know me, then the chances of them listening to me and learning from me is low. Similarly, as an instructor to students who come from a different generation than I do, I am a millennial. Part of what I have to do to try to be a good teacher, is a good educator, is to know some things about y'all's culture and cultural background and cultural orientation, to try to build a bridge between what you all know, how you all think, your toolkits for solving problems, so that you can use those tools to be able to learn some new information and hopefully expand the toolkit that you have. So if you come in with a tool belt and I come in and shame you in my class for what tools you have, instead of trying to show how you can use some of those tools to learn something new, to learn how to use a different tool, then the chances of you wanting to even take that tool from me, that new tool that I'm offering, the chances of that happening are pretty slim. But if you come in with your tool belt and I say, oh, you have a hammer, well, here's this other type of way of doing something. It's not a hammer. Let's say it's, I don't know, a drill. If I don't make any connections, and if I don't say hammers are important in these contexts, but also this is helpful similarly in this context, if I do that, then I'm more likely to help to be a good teacher in the sense of you actually learning. And if I shame you for the tools that you have, then that thing in our brain called our amygdala, the thing that dictates how we respond to fear and anger, if some people call it the guard dog in our head, if I trigger that guard dog, then it's going to be really hard for you to learn anything that I got to say from that point forward, because your fear response has been triggered. So if I'm speaking to a 90-year-old about YouTube, I might make a reference to the television and how with the YouTube is sort of like cable TV, except instead of being with a remote on your phone, or sorry, a remote at your house, there's a bunch of different channels that are on the internet that you can find on demand by just using the search bar. And as long as you have internet access. Using the TV and using how, even though it may have been annoying at first to learn how the TV operates, or there were some blips or what have you, but they learned it and they found it to be valuable. Similarly, YouTube, even though it might be hard at first to learn it, the benefits of it may be multiplied when compared to cable news, because you get to be able to watch what you want to watch whenever you want it, not just on demand from cable news providers, but on demand from creators and creative folks throughout the globe. You can even watch shows that you loved watching 30, 40, 50 years ago. You may even be able to find some of them on YouTube. If my grandma was still here, I would say some of her favorite sermons from pastors like T.D. Jakes or Joel Osteen or whoever, Creflo Dollar, whoever, that rather than waiting for what the Christian channel on cable news shows you, or instead of just trying to make sure you record the right thing so you can watch it on YouTube, you can be able to flip back and forth. You can pause, you can come back to it, to a bunch of different sermons that people have uploaded of those people, and you can watch it instantly. That is the power of YouTube. That is what culturally responsive teaching looks like in a nutshell. So what is culturally responsive organizing? As I said in the last video, Culture responsive organizing is using the tools of culture responsive teaching to try to be persuasive to other people for a campaign that you want to lead, and a campaign for how to think and how to behave that you want to lead, or that you want other folks to join. So organizing, in other words, is taking the tools of culture responsive teaching and using it to expand the population of people who support an initiative, activity, a belief, an approach to behavior, a usage of a tool that you believe will be beneficial for them. And you want to persuade them to pick up that tool. That is what organizing, in a nutshell, that's a simplification, but that is what organizing looks like. An example of an organizing tool is, and what culture responsive organizing looks like in practice is, imagine if you want to convince, let's say you're at a school and you want to convince at a college that convince the population of teachers to move all their classes online on Monday. One way to do that is to just go talk to some teachers and just plead and explain why that's important. But from an organizing perspective, if you want to expand the population of people who are part of it, part of that network or that campaign, you want to figure out who are the people who agree, who are the people who disagree, and then try to work with the people who agree to make contact with the people who disagree, and be able to make contact in a way that's persuasive to be able to bring more people into that fold. And a good way to do that is to look for, amongst the people who disagree with that argument, that initiative that you want, is to find out who are the people who have influence, who are viewed as leaders, who are viewed as smart by the folks, by other teachers. Find out who those people are and try to persuade them first to join that campaign, so they can use their influence to justify and legitimize what you're talking about too. But you have to approach them with the lens of a culture responsive teacher, or else you are at risk of using bad methods for learning to try to get somebody to learn something new. Culture responsive teaching, culture responsive education, that's a good set of tools. That's what good teaching and learning looks like. And if it's not culture responsive, you're probably not going to be successful. You're going to be like a comedian who is making references to things that existed 100 years ago, trying to speak to a group of teenagers and wondering why they're not laughing. It's because they don't know what you're talking about. And it's because they don't know you. And some people take a lack of responsiveness as a sign of disrespect. So what does culture responsive organizing look like? What's a image to capture what that looks like? Because as I said to some of you in class, that I'm a person who needs images and not just words. So I'm going to draw it in person right now. Let's say, just to simplify it, -1 m plus 1. Let me just get a different marker real quick. Oops. Don't laugh at me for that, y'all. This is live, clearly. Okay. Go Bills. All right. Yes, thank you to my wife. Shout out to Mrs. Sarah Simmons for having some amazing markers readily available. Let's do it like this. So imagine that there is a number line from -2 to +2, like so. So imagine -2 to +2. And I'm going to ask if you can draw this out because you're going to need to do this. So draw a number line. -2 to +2 along a spectrum. Above -2, write actively opposed. Amongst or above -1, write passively opposed. Above the 0, write not sure and quote unquote neutral. +1, passively in support, and put amongst or above +2, active support. So it looks like the words are above and the number lines here. Next thing I want you to do is to draw a curved arrow between each of those points in the number line. So I'm going to draw it and show you what I mean. You see the curved arrow? And then lastly, I want you to draw an arrow down for each of the numbers. So swoop, arrow down, swoop, arrow down. Here's what coach responsive, here's what that continuum or that spectrum looks like. Imagine that you have some teachers who are actively opposed to the idea of canceling or having class be online on Monday. Under the arrow that points down, I want you to write out what is something that you think somebody who is actively opposed would say and do. So, for example, somebody who is actively opposed from my perspective might say, we cannot we cannot have class online because learning suffers and we have some work to do to improve learning after COVID. So I put it under the arrow because that's what I suspect, that if I was to do, if I was to talk to a bunch of people in a random school, in that school I'm talking about, and find amongst the people who are actively opposed, what would they say and do? That's something that I can anticipate that they might say and do. If we were doing this in practice, I would actually ask you to go find out, but we're just learning the continuum first, or the spectrum, sorry, first. And the difference between somebody who's actively opposed and passively opposed is that somebody who is actively opposed is not somebody only who disagrees with what you're saying, but they're also somebody who wants to do things to convince other people. So saying we cannot have class online because learning suffers, that's one thing. But saying we have some work to do to increase learning after COVID because it's made learning so much more difficult, that's something that somebody might say who wants to actively get people to resist the idea of class being online on Monday. Somebody who is passively opposed might say, I don't like it, but I won't fight it. And so I put it under the arrow. Somebody who is a neutral might say, I don't know, and I don't care. Just tell me what to do before Monday. That's somebody who's like a not sure neutral. That's what they might say. A plus one might say, um, somebody who's passively in support. Maybe it's not somebody who's passively, is somebody who agrees, but they're not going to actively try to persuade other people to agree. They might say, I would like it. I would like it, and think others would too. And think others would too. And now for the plus two, for the active support, the ideal is that you want people who are a plus two to not only are really under the arrow, you want to put what do you want that, what do you wish other people would say and do. So if I want class to be online on Monday, a plus two, the ideal, is somebody who says we need to have it online because what would a plus two say? Who would be my ideal? My ideal would say, I want them to say we need to have it online because it's the right thing to do in this stressful climate, and other people need to call their friends and bosses to support this initiative. So under each of these arrows, you have what the label, somebody who's actively opposed, and you have, based on your experience, and if we're doing this more actively, if we're actually organizing, I would have you to find amongst the people who are negative too, what are some of the things that they are likely to say and do. But for now, we're just using our imagination. After you do that, the next step is to think. And this is where the really hard part is. This gives you your sense of the lay of the land. Now think, what is something I could say and or do, or other people who agree with me, what could we say or do to get them to go from a -2 to a -1? So something that I could say or do, potentially, and this is really hard, to get them to go from a -2 to a -1 might be, let's say, have a private conversation to find out what they need and what they're afraid of, and ask if they would consider keeping it to themselves for X reasons, just some reasons that I would have to come up with. And those reasons will be based on what I've learned about what they need and what they're afraid of. So if they say on Monday, or one thing that I need is like, I need in person because I'm just so afraid about the loss of learning that's taking place in COVID. I might talk to that person and say, I'm also worried about the learning loss in COVID, but I'm also afraid that if you go out actively telling people to deny the option of online on Monday, that you could also be helping aid or contribute to the learning loss because a bunch of students are not going to come to class, but they might join online if the option is there. So I might say, Can we at least agree that it can be an option? And if I promote it as an option instead of a campaign to say everybody needs to be online, would you chill out and not be a negative two who's actively opposing and trying to get other people to believe that? Would you go to, yeah, I might disagree, but I'm not going to try to organize in the opposite direction of you? Let's say somebody who is a negative one who's passively opposed, under that swoop, you want to put what is something that I could say or do to get them from passively opposed to accepting that actually they might not sure. So they're not sure. So I might say something like, um, should we prevent online learning because of your feelings? Actually, no, that's way too direct. Whoa. I might say, let me scratch that because that's not culturally responsive. I might say instead something like, what would persuade you to see that there could be benefits? I'm focusing on the thought process for the passively opposed instead of the thought and the behavior of the actively opposed, because they're in that category who they're not going to actively organize a resistance to that initiative. So I could focus on their attitudes, and because they're not a negative two, there might be more resources that I could bring to the table, or more things I could use to be able to persuade them. And one way is like, well, they have probably been persuaded to not be a negative two. So just ask them what persuaded them to not be a negative two and be a negative one, but use different language that makes sense to them. And then by asking some questions like, what would persuade you to see that there could be benefits, you can get them to go from a negative one to a zero, because they're like, well, actually, as they're talking about what would persuade them, you can then say, well, here's the case based on that for why we should have class online, to get them to start to say, well, actually, you made some good points. I could see both sides now. And then do the same for the 0 to +1 and the +1 to +2. To me, if in our culture, in our society, if groups of student leaders, groups of teacher leaders, group of administrators, if we approached our desires for social change, if we approached it with game planning like this, with this culture responsive continuum, or if you want to call it the culture responsive organizing spectrum, I don't care what you call it. You can call it Teddy Pendergrass, all I care. You all probably don't know who that is. You could call it Keisha Cole, all I care. Or Jay-Z. Shout out to Jigga. If we did this, if we formed groups of people to approach things with a culture responsive organizing perspective, which is very sociological because we're talking about patterns, we're talking about methods, we're talking about theory. We're not just talking about the hearts and minds of individuals or biology or psychology. We're talking about patterns, groups, theory, methods. If we approached our advocacy for change as culture responsive organizers, then we would be more likely to be successful. We'd be more persuasive. And all of this is nonviolent. Because now, what happens now is you start to become very interested in what people who disagree with you, or even actively disagree with you, you actually want to hear what they say. Not because you want to act like you want to hear what they say. You genuinely want to hear what, not only what an individual says, but what the patterns, what large amounts of people say and do, because you want to figure out where are they on this continuum, and you want to figure out how can I advocate to them to make a step in the right direction, and how can I use the tools of culture responsive teaching, of good teaching, of compassionate teaching, of effective teaching, to get them to come a little bit closer to the +2 on that continuum. To me, this is not only a part of the tradition of servant leadership and nonviolent advocacy that Dr. King promoted. Granted, this is not, you're not on the streets or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you are somebody who cares about not only what you're passionate about, but you also care about peace and nonviolence and like rebuilding skills to advocate for change in a way that doesn't contribute to what I would say a culture of violence with words and deeds. And you actually want to model the opposite, especially for the folks who are looking to us. I'm not saying this is the only way, but this is one way. I've found it to be helpful. Some other teachers have found it to be helpful. And I know I can look in the mirror and say, even in dark moments like we're in right now, and say, I'm trying my best not to contribute to that, to a culture of disrespect, to a culture of hate, to a culture of violence, or anything like that. Regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, too. I hope you all found this to be useful and to be helpful. And for next class, what I'm going to ask you to do is to identify, identify something that you're passionate about that you wish people would say and do. And it has to be something social. So let's say you're really passionate about wanting college to be free for all, or healthcare to be free for all. Or let's say that you're somebody who is passionate about wanting to get the whole population in the United States to become vegan or vegetarian, whatever it is that you're passionate about. I want you to use that to recreate this continuum. Once you've identified what that passionate subject is, you create that continuum. I want you to put actively opposed, passively opposed, not sure, neutral, passively in support, and actively support on the top. And then under the +2 arrow, I want you to put, what is it that you wish people would say and do? So what is that ideal for what you're passionate about? And then using your imagination, and then also you can use conversations with other friends. You can talk to your parents, you can talk to your guardians, you can post it on social media and say, hey, like, can somebody help me? If you're opposed to being vegan, what's your best argument? You can go on YouTube and listen to some debates, whatever. I just want you, to the best of your ability, to try to fill in the rest of this chart. So what would a -2 say who's actively opposed to being vegan? What would a -1 say? What would a 0 say and do? What would a +1 say and do? And then by that point, you've already done a +2. And then lastly, for the third component, I want you to put the arrows down and fill in the swoops, what is something that you can say and or do based on this lecture, based on what you've heard from other classes in this class, other sessions, and based on the readings, and based on what you've heard or learned in other sociology classes, whatever you want to bring to the table. Just what is one thing you can say and or do to get them to go from a -2 to a -1, a -1 to a 0, etc. And I want you to bring a copy of this sheet. You can do it on your computer, you can use Canva, you can use PowerPoint, or you can use a handwritten. And make sure you put your name at the top so I know who you are. I want you to create that and bring it to class. And know that there's a chance that before I collect it, you might be swapping with other people. So you can take a look, which is why I need your names on it too. The readings will be helpful for this as well. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you to it to get started. You have until class on Monday. Please bring it. And I am so excited to see how you all made sense of this video, and then also to see what your spectrums look like. And as a final note, I want you on the maybe perhaps on the back of that page on a separate page, just give me some of your thoughts about what I shared. You can say I disagree with the whole thing, and here's why. You can say I agree with the whole thing, and here's why. You can say I was talking to my friend and they agreed, but I disagreed, and here's why. Just give one paragraph or a few bullet points about what you thought. And that's part of the processing of it. So you can put it in a bag, put it in a separate piece of paper, just make sure your name is on it. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a good and safe weekend. Thank you all so much for your prayers and for the kind words that you've said. And I hope you all have a blessed weekend. Thank you, and go Bills.